if they needed me, I'd take my chances on how I could get in. Anyhow, I was selected. There was a first sergeant, a buck sergeant, and Private Stewart that went to Fort Benning at the end of January of 42.
Okay, and then this was officer
training.
Officer training school. Okay.
So it was the so-called 90-day wonders, 3 months course at Fort Benning, Georgia.
And were you a 90-day wonder at the end of it?
You got commissioned as a second lieutenant at the end of it if you made it. What happened to me was that I had a very favorite aunt married to a brother of my father's, and they were living in Seattle. They had retired from their home in Missoula, Montana, where my father's family came from. And they were running a little mom and pop grocery out on Sandpoint Drive, out on the shore of above the shore of Lake Washington. And she had a blood nephew who was a full colonel, second in command at Fort Benning. And she wrote to him and told him who I was and that I was coming there. And he and his wife very kindly invited me to their home for dinner. And when I got to Fort Benning, and he said, young man, this is a tough program, but if you make it, you tell me where you want to go, and I'll help to see that you get there. Well, I made it. And I was
officers training.
I completed officers training, commissioned as a second lieutenant, and I had a month, so I think I had 2 or 3 weeks of leave, spent time in New England where my sister was going to school, and New York, where I had a good relative friend.
And you knew where you wanted to go.
I wanted to go to the 1st Battalion, 87th Mountain Infantry Reinforced, which was the initial unit that took training at Mount Rainier in skiing.
So you wanted to go to the ski troops.
I wanted to go to the ski troops.
You were able to fulfill
and
that.
I was assigned there in June of 42.
And then you had engaged in quite a bit of mountaineering and ski training.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, the first thing I was trained is that the colonel in command of the battalion, ordinarily it wouldn't take a full colonel, but this was called the 1st Battalion, 87th Mountain Infantry Reinforced. Reinforced meant that they had attached units that ordinarily wouldn't be in a battalion organization, only in a regimental or higher.
And it wasn't the 10th Mountain Division yet?
No.
So this is...
No, long before.
The
It
embryonic
was just
form.
the 1st Battalion, 87th Mountain Infantry Reinforced. And we had a mule platoon. We learned to pack mules. The officers had to learn to ride because the colonel in command was a cavalryman. So we were, after the day's work at 4:30 in the afternoon, all the officers got on horseback and were taught how to ride. I'd never been on a horse.
So here you are.
In 2 or 3 weeks, I was leaping a 3-foot log, controlling the horse with my knees.
So your goal is to be in the ski troops and you end up riding mules.
Riding horses.
Horses, which...
And leading mules.
I found a news clipping on the internet from the International News Service, January 13th, 1943. And the headline is, "Troops training at Camp Hale are tough triple threat men, must be able to ski, ride mules, and use mountain motorized equipment. None but real he-men need apply." Did you consider yourself a real he-man?
I was certified as a ski teacher by the Pacific Northwest Ski Association. I skied until 2003, four years ago. And then I had a spinal stenosis that damaged my sciatic nerve. This leg is slightly atrophied. I have kind of a drop foot, and I had to give up skiing. It's not safe.
So you taught the troops to ski, yes?
I was one of the teachers.
Tell me about that. How was that organized?
Well,
Anything like
the ski troops was really a misnomer. We were mountain infantry, trained to operate off-the-road system with pack mules and equipment that where trucks and vehicles couldn't go. And I was in the outfit until September, and one day at noon, I and 10 other officers and 20 qualified enlisted men were told to be ready to get on the train at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and go to Camp Edwards, Massachusetts, which is on Cape Cod. And our mission there was to learn rock climbing and to teach rock climbing.
Had you rock climbed before?
No. I'd climbed lots of mountains, scrambled up the mountains, but I had no
Around
experience
Juneau.
with rope party technique. But they had,
You had that natural scrambling ability, probably living at the foot of Mount Juneau, one of the steepest mountains.
I'd climbed a lot of mountains, but not by rope party technique. Anyhow, you know how rocky and mountainous Cape Cod is. What they had was what I would call a dry wash. In times of heavy rain, there would be a flood of water. And so the sand on Cape Cod was cut by these veritable small canyons with steep sides. And we cut small trees, limbed them, and fastened them together from behind and laid them up against these steep banks and cut notches in them and traversed those wooden walls and learned rope party technique from Swiss climbers that were members of our organization that knew how to rock climb. So we were taught not only...
So the Swiss were recruited by the Americans and made part of...
Not many of them. There were just a few, but they were expert mountaineers, expert rock climbers. So we learned how to climb rocks and how to teach rock climbing. And
so you learned.
And here's how we our first experience really at teaching. The 36th Infantry Division from Texas came to Franconia Notch in New Hampshire. And there's a feature there that was known as the Great Stone Face. There are sharp cliffs, solid granite, very good rock, hard rock. And the troops were divided in, the regiments were divided in two. In the morning, half of them would climb rocks, and the other half were taught Norwegian.
Norwegian?
We had little manuals that had been published that had useful phrases in English and Norwegian in English.
And why Norwegian?
Well, we assumed they were going to making a landing in Norway, which the Germans had taken over. And so we were up there for about 6 weeks, studying Norwegian half the day, teaching rock climbing the other half of the day. Several years later, I was at a reunion of the 10th Mountain Division in Sun Valley. And the major who had been in command of that operation, teaching rock climbing to the 36th Infantry Division, said, "Do you know what that was all about?" Because the 36th Infantry Division left that training and went directly to North Africa and fought the Germans. Fought the Germans in North Africa. He said it was a feint, a planned maneuver. They did not try to keep secret that we were studying rock climbing and Norwegian. And as a consequence, the Germans moved 2 whole divisions to Norway to repulse the anticipated attack that never came.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's a story I didn't expect to hear.
I didn't expect it to happen. And then after this unit disbanded, we went to Wisconsin and went up to the North Michigan Peninsula and taught winter camping and cross-country skiing to the 2nd Infantry Division. And I was teaching the colonel in command of one of the regiments. The temperatures ranged from 25 below zero in the daytime to 50 below at night.
So how did you survive winter camping? This is before Gore-Tex, fleece,
Well, we had doubled down sleeping bags, and we had tents that had a floor. You pitch them in the snow, and because these were maneuvers, exercises in what we would face if we were in the war, we couldn't have fires except every 3rd day.
So a little cold.
It was cold. When we go to bed at night, we'd take our ski boots. We had little brushes to brush off the snow, put them inside the sleeping bag under our armpits.
It's the only way to keep them from freezing.
Keep them from freezing so we could put them on in the morning. And I did that for about 6 weeks.
And then you taught cross-country skiing.
And winter camping.
And winter camping.
January, February into March.
So, these troops are known as really a test lab for winter camping,
Right.
mountain rescue,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
Did you ever feel like a guinea pig, or like the troops you were
Well,
teaching?
not really. I had a sergeant in my company who was a Finn, and he was in the operation where the Finns defeated the Russians on cross-country skis because they were expert skiers, cross-country skiers, and the Russians were not.
So there was an advantage to
Yeah.
being a good skier.
Yeah. Two of the men in my command, when I was teaching cross-country skiing and winter camping, had been the North American cross-country champion skiers. One was named Ralph Townsend, and one was named Wendy Broomhall. And each of them had won the North American cross-country skiing championships. And they were teaching me how to do that.
And you were able to pass on that expertise to the novices that you were teaching.
Well,
I'm curious about your ski teaching, both the downhill and the cross country during this time, because I'm also a part-time ski
on
instructor.
that, when we were on those maneuvers, this was south of a place called Lake Gogebic. Lake Gogebic is a good-sized lake, which, of course, it was 50 below zero at night and solidly frozen and covered with snow. It was south of Lake Superior on the upper Michigan Peninsula. Waters meet Iron Mountain, Iron River. I used to do recreational skiing at Iron Mountain. But we started out one day for a cross-country venture. The whole regiment that I was working with was lined up in a column of threes, 1,000 men each column, 3,000 men in the regiment. And I was at the head of the column with the colonel. And we came to a dry wash, just like it was on Cape Cod, a sandy area with steep banks. That when high water came, a front rains, and would cut a minor canyon in the sand. I got to this place. I got to one side of it. It would have taken me 5 minutes to go down the bank, across the bank, climb the other one on my skis. But I was taking the colonel. It took me an hour to get the colonel onto the other side.
He didn't feel as comfortable on skis as you did.
the lesson that we learned was people without that kind of background can't fight in winter.
So, those of you who had the background, who had the
We could function, but
So when you say 3,000 people, were there 3,000 people on skis?
yes.
So what was that like? I mean, I've seen some of this newsreel footage of just, all these guys in the
White uniforms.
white uniforms, and weren't the skis white as
Yes.
well? And they were wooden
Yeah.
with the bear trap bindings?
I once went through 1,000 pair of skis, picking out the best pair for me.
Seriously.
Seriously.
You got the best Luger and the best pair of skis. So,
But
That's
let's
amazing.
focus for a minute on skiing. All the time we were in the North Apennines, I saw one action on skis. We had gone from Naples in a small Italian freighter up to Livorno, otherwise known as Leghorn, which is just inland from Pisa. And we had our first exposure to battle on the shore just north of Livorno. We set up I had a platoon in my company, and the man in charge of it remains a very close friend. His name is Rocco Siciliano, and he had 3 81 millimeter howitzers. Howitzers are guns that fire the shell in an arc, as distinguished from a gun that fires flat, quick, fast trajectory. You can actually, if you're standing off away from it, you can actually watch the shell arc up and go to where it's going to land, which may be half a mile away. Anyhow, losing my train of thought.
so you're watching the howitzer.
This is in Italy.
Right.
We took a small freighter from Naples to Livorno, got off and went to trucks and went inland. And the first operation we had was firing these guns on a defense on a mountain about a mile away. And then we had what was intended to be a secret operation. This is a place called Cotigliano, which is a small village. I would say it's in a canyon, sort of like the Perseverance Canyon. Mount Roberts on one side and Mount Juneau on the other side. Almost as steep as that. And we went up there in the middle of the night with just tiny little glimmer lights so the one truck or one Jeep could see the one in front of it, but it not bright enough to be seen by the Germans who occupied the mountain. And our mission was what's called a combat patrol. There are 2 types of patrols, basically. Reconnaissance patrol, which is maybe a dozen men that go out in the middle of the night sneaking around, trying to locate enemy positions without being seen or heard. That's a reconnaissance patrol. A combat patrol is a fighting unit that goes out in the daytime and attacks a position to determine its strength. So we went up and we left the highway right across the road. We were camped in what was called the King's Own Hunting Ground, which is right across the highway from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And Cotigliano was about 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers north of that. We went up there in the middle of the night, and the next morning, one of our companies in white uniforms and white skis went out as a combat patrol. I and the battalion commander and several other officers went to the other side of the valley, which was not quite as steep. And there was no road, but there were about 200 or 300 stairs that went up the side of the hill to a privately owned 4-story villa. We went up there to the top of that villa and watched the action with our field glasses. The soldiers moved out on the other side of the valley, and the Germans observed what they were doing, and they had German scouts dug into the snow, and our people skied right over them, got beyond them, and then with their radios, they called down artillery fire from up on the mountain where the Germans had artillery weapons, and it was a failure. The mission was a failure.
So,
I don't know how many men we lost, but we lost some of the men, and they were not able to. They were able to find out that it was well defended.
so the one mission that you observed on skis was a failure,
Yes.
and not much battle took place using skis after all that training at Camp Hale in Colorado.
That's why I say to you that ski troops is a misnomer. We're mountain infantry. It's trained to operate off the road system in mountains.
So really, the benefit of all that training was the today's ski industry, where you have a lot of the pioneers.
Yeah, a lot of the men came back who were expert skiers and settled in the Denver area or the Salt Lake area and set up ski operations.
And also, this is the roots of the ski patrol was a 10th
Yeah,
Mountain Division.
right.
And you were part of the ski patrol here in Juneau.
Yeah.
So when you came back to Juneau, you were part of, as you'd call it, I don't know if they call it a ski industry here, but you were a big part of the Juneau Ski Club. And ski
Well, I was the president of the Juneau Ski Club, and we originally, the first skiing in Juneau was Norm Banfield and Ernie Parsons and Kurt Shattuck. And they bought a little, what's called a Sweden Speed ski tow. It's a small gas engine mounted on a toboggan with pulleys, and they had a half-inch rope, and they pulled it up the Perseverance Road, and just beyond where the Granite Creek Trail takes off, there was a meadow that was open. It was a muskeg, and there was a cabin at the head of it. And a fellow named Sandy Williams had that cabin. He was a prospector. And they fastened that toboggan to a tree at the base of that slope and ran the rope up to the top of the meadow and fixed the pulley there. And so they had a little ski tow, half-inch rope, and they could ride up the meadow on their skis and ski back down. And then they could ski back home on the Perseverance Trail, which was, at that point in time, was a road. It wasn't just a trail, a gravel road. Well, that was over on Douglas. No, they moved. Meantime, the CCCs had built the ski trail.
The Dan Moeller Trail.
The Dan Moeller Trail,
Yeah.
up to the meadow above the tree line there, above the lower tree line, and they set that machine up on that meadow. And then when I came home from the war, I had never been in the interior of Alaska. My father had been working up there for years. Both of my brothers had been there, but I'd never been there. So I was on leave for about a month, accumulated leave time. And so I took the ship to Valdez. My brother was the head of the road commission there, my oldest brother. And he picked me up, and meantime they had built the road from Glen Allen down into Palmer. They hadn't built the road to Stewart yet. And I went there and I got on the train in Anchorage and went down to Seward. And there I discovered a ski tow. It was an automobile engine and the pulleys and the ropes that had been used in Seward by the Army unit that had been based there during the war. This was in the fall of '45. I bought the whole thing for $50, shipped it on the Alaska steamship Juneau, came back here and I was the president of the ski club, and we took it over and hauled it up to what was called the second meadow, above the Treadwell ditch. There was a better, steeper slope, open muskeg type slope. And we ran the ski operation there for about 2 years.
So here you were, a new 10th Mountain Division veteran. You get an old piece of old rope tow that was used for training during the war. You bring it to
Wasn't
Juneau.
used for training, it was used by the soldiers for recreation
Okay, for recreation.
in Kodiak.
You buy it for $50, you get it to Juneau, and that is really the start of recreational alpine skiing.
And then
in
Dean
Juneau.
Williams and I, do you know Dean Williams?
Yes.
Dean and I grew up together, and we still today are best friends. And we decided that that operation wasn't what we really wanted, because the snow conditions were often not very good. Heavy, wet snow. But up in the basin behind that ridge there, in this what's known as the Douglas Ski Bowl, was excellent skiing. So we got to work and we raised $10,000. And I went to Oregon and bought a Tucker snowcat. The Tucker snowcat had been designed for use by Admiral Byrd when he went to Antarctica on an expedition. And it was, you don't see them anymore. They're unique vehicles. The vehicle itself, it had 4 pontoon like this and like this and like this, and it had a track that went around it. The 2 forward ones could be steered like the wheels on a car, and they had a bar and then a space before the next one. So the weight of the vehicle actually sat on the snow, because the snow came up between those bars across that track. And it had, the bars on the ends had a kind of a blade. So
this is Juneau's first groomer?
Pardon?
The first groomer?
Yeah. So we bought that for $10,000, and in order partly to raise the money, we had a big winter parade. We had that vehicle at the head of the parade, a bunch of Juneau skiers behind it, and Pete Wood. Didn't he mean anything to you?
I don't recognize him.
Well, Peter Wood was a character of the country, and he went behind us with a big sign that said, "Yeah, but what if it rains?" But the day was good, and we took it down the street, and we had a sled race and a cross-country skiing race, and we had a big program and a dance that night, and helped to raise the $10,000 to buy that vehicle. And it had a sled that would seat 25 people. There could be 8 people. I should answer the phone.
Oh.
Hand me that, thank you.
There you are.
And then we would have maybe,
Was that Ula?
that was Ula.
Okay.
That came from,
Yeah.
I'm Ula Skijumper from Norway, brought up on Lutefiskenshill. I come to New York to find me some work. I think I go west right away. I join up the mountain battalion to fight for the USA.
You got your Okay, can you start your song one more time? Because we got the phone in the way. Okay, so the ULA song. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is one of the songs that we used to sing a lot in the ski troops, the
Okay.
mountain infantry. This is one of the songs that we sang.
And
I'm Ola Skijomper from Norway, brought up on Lutefiskenshill. I come to New York for my son to find me some work. I think I go west right away. I hop on the train for Fort Lewis to fight for the USA. I join up the mountain battalion, and here I think I will stay. Oh, I'm Ola, they all call me Ola. Don't know where they get a hold of my name. I never told any them feller, but they call me Ola, just the same.
so
There are other verses, I won't sing other verses.
so that's how your Norwegian lessons came in handy.
We had Norwegian people in the outfit, like Ola. And we named, and when I came back from the war, I used to sing this song in the ski club meetings, and we named that vehicle Ola after that song.
So it's amazing how much your experience, in World War II influenced your involvement with skiing here in Juneau. Now, were you part of the ski patrol as well?
I was never regularly part of ski patrol. I did work, I did ski patrol work, and people that broke their ankle or their leg or something, I took them down the mountain on a toboggan. But
There were several 10th Mountain Division veterans who ended up pioneering the ski patrol movement here in
across
this country.
the nation, the ski patrol movement existed before the mountain infantry, and there was the man who was the head of it persuaded the commanding general of American forces to develop a mountain and skiing program. And that was from the National Ski Patrol. I was a member of the National Ski Patrol. I still have a badge from that.
And Professional Ski Instructors of America as well. Now, I want to get back to I want to finish out this interview with sort of your readjustment to civilian life and how your experience in the war ultimately shaped how you live your life. But before we do that, you did have some pretty fascinating experiences on the Aleutian Islands.
That's right.
Can you
Here's what happened there.
And when? Set the stage with that as when.
Yeah. My experience in the Aleutians began on the 15th day of August, 1943. The Japanese had occupied the outer island of Attu and the island of Kiska, about 200 miles east of Attu. The whole Aleutian chain is about 1,000 miles long. Their main base was Kiska. At Kiska, they had
The Japanese.
the Japanese. They landed there in 42, the summer of 42, and there was nobody living on Kiska, but on Attu there was a contingent of Americans who were working there, and they were all captured and taken to Japan. But it was a big embarrassment to the American nation, to the military, that the Japanese had taken American soil. They didn't advertise it very much, but they didn't like it either. So they they decided strategically to take Attu first and then take Kiska. Well, we had some people who were experts in clothing and equipment and what's required of going into the mountains. And the Aleutians are a mountainous country. And they tried to persuade the people that were leading this expedition to Attu to equip the soldiers with proper footgear. But the Army didn't listen to them. The soldiers that landed on Attu in April of 1943, there was still snow out there, lots of rain, miserable weather.
And they hadn't been trained in that kind of weather as well.
Hadn't been trained in that kind of weather. And they were out there for 3 weeks capturing the island, which they were successful in doing, but at a very heavy cost, because those soldiers spent 3 weeks in trenches that had cold water in them, ordinary GI foot gear, and they had more casualties from trench foot than they did from Japanese action. Men lost their toes, lost their feet. It was horrible. So, but they either killed off all the Japanese, or when the Japanese recognized that they were defeated, they killed themselves. A lot of them did. Took a hand grenade and let it explode.
But at this time, when this was occurring with the trench foot, you weren't in the enlisted
This was not a mountain infantry.
Right.
This was an ordinary infantry unit that went there. So as a result of that experience, they decided to send my regiment to Kiska, where the landing was to take place in the middle of August 43, about 3 months after the Attu operation.
And at that time, the Japanese were still in control?
Very much so, on Kiska. There were about 5,500 Japanese on Kiska. They had 3 missions. Number one, they had 6 two-man submarines, and they were going to harass ocean traffic in the Inside Passage and in the Gulf of Alaska with those two-man submarines. Secondly, they had radio jamming equipment, and my friend Dean Williams was in the U.S. Signal Corps, and he was assigned out at Nome, and he said that the Japanese gave them fits jamming their radio signals, interfering with the Army Signal Corps communications. And thirdly, they were building an airstrip on top of Kiska Head, which is a long peninsula, quite flat, long enough to accommodate a small landing field. And so they had a lot of specialized people out there, the Japanese did. And once Attu had been taken, they knew that they were outflanked and they were going to lose those people if they stayed there.
The Japanese?
Yes.
So Attu was taken by the Americans?
Attu was taken by the Americans. And now this is about the 14th of August. When we went ashore in Kiska, there's a sergeant whom I knew well. His name was Sherman Smith. He was not in my company. He was in another company, another battalion of my regiment. But he had been in a company that I had been first assigned to before I became the company commander of battalion headquarters. And he did something that I wouldn't do. When we landed on Kiska, the troops were not told that the Japanese were probably not there. We landed expecting to be engaged in fight. And the landing force included, there were 50,000 men involved in that landing. They had 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and about 50 destroyers and DE boats. And all those naval ships were firing their big shells on the island as we went up the hill. So that there was, the sights and sounds of battle were there, but it was spooky because we weren't getting any small arms return fire. It wasn't until noon of the following day, we landed at 5 o'clock in the morning. Noon of the following day, the realization sunk in, there were no Japanese on that island.
And more than 5,000 Japanese had escaped under your nose?
Here's what happened. Before our landing force went there, the last part of July, well, actually back from at least January, maybe earlier, the Americans blockaded the island of Kiska. They had two cruisers and 5 destroyers that circled the island constantly, about 40 miles offshore, to prevent any resupply or rearming of the Kiska base. This soldier, Sherman Smith, when we landed on the island, he did something that I wouldn't have done. The Japanese had dug a lot of tunnels, and he went into their headquarters tunnel where they had their military headquarters, their hospital, and protection for the Japanese soldiers from the American bombing that was taking place regularly whenever the weather allowed. And all he had was a plumber's candle. He didn't even have a flashlight. But he was a determined souvenir hunter. He spotted tripwires on the floor, realized it was booby-trapped, managed to avoid the wires, and he found a Japanese sun flag about that big, private flag of a Japanese non-commissioned officer.
And the Japanese were all gone at that point.
Yes. Well, he found this flag, and he folded it up and put it in his pocket to take home. We were out there from August until December
Of 1943.
43. And when we came home, we landed in Seattle, and we had a couple weeks leave, and he had his home was there, his wife was there, so he took that flag and put it in his bureau or someplace, and then we went to Camp Hale, which had been formed, and the division had been formed while we were up there, and retrained at Camp Hale.
So
Some of the
Camp
roughest,
Hale
pardon?
and the 10th Mountain Division officially formed while you were in the Aleutians.
Yeah.
So you returned to the States and you go to Camp
They,
Hale
they had
established.
they had 3 regiments,
Right.
the 85th, the 86th, and the 90th. Took the place of the 87th, which was our regiment.
And did Roosevelt have to be convinced to form that 10th Mountain Division to make it?
Yeah, the head of the National Ski Patrol convinced George Marshall, the head of the Army, to do that we needed a mountain organization. Anyhow, this Sergeant Smith had this flag. We came back and immediately went to Camp Hale, and probably the most rugged circumstance we ever confronted was a 2-week maneuver at Camp Hale. It was called the D Series. 2 of the regiments, the 85th and the 86th, were an assault group, and the 87th was a defense group occupying a ridgetop above Camp Hale, between Camp Hale and what's now Vail. And we were out in the snow fighting that maneuver for 2 weeks. And again, the temperatures were 25, 35 below at night, and the snow was deep, and it was a rugged time.
It sounded pretty rough.
Yeah. And then
What was the worst part of it for you?
the cold and the snow, living out in the snow with no fires, no warmth.
Did anybody not make it? Did anybody kind of?
Well, a lot of people went to the hospital with frozen feet, and but I don't know. I don't know of
It was a bad winter.
anybody that died. But it was the roughest experience that we had, more difficult than in Italy
And this is a training
in
experience
terms of the living conditions.
in Colorado.
Anyhow, we went from there in the spring of '44. We went to Austin, Texas, a place called Camp Swift, about 25 miles north of Austin, Texas, for weapons training, more advanced training in the use of our weapons. And then we were sent to Italy. we sailed out of Newport News, Virginia, on the USS America, which had been renamed the West Point. Basically, the whole division.
That was in January of 1945.
Early January of '45.
Okay.
And we sailed to Naples, and then some of the soldiers went by train up to Florence, which had been taken by the Americans. And my regiment went to Livorno, and I told you about that. Anyhow, Sergeant Smith collected a lot of souvenirs. And when the war was over and we came back and he came home to Seattle, it was a little later.
He still got the flag.
Pardon?
He still has the flag.
He had the flag.
Right.
It was in his bureau.
Right.
And he had a lot of German souvenirs. And he used to set up an exhibit of a German camp with mannequins in German uniforms, and
A little museum.
sort of a little museum that he had in his house. And we would have a reunion, and he'd display it at the reunions. Anyhow, finally he got back to the flag, and it had Japanese writing on it. So we took it to a Japanese friend in Seattle to translate the writing, and it belonged to a Japanese soldier named Kaoru Katsukabe. And so he wanted to get in touch with him. So he wrote to a mountaineering organization in Tokyo that he got an address for. Do you know a mountaineer, a mountain soldier named Karl Katsukabe? And he was the secretary of that organization.
Oh my gosh.
And he spoke quite good English. He had been reared in Seattle till he was about 12 years old, and then his family had moved back to Japan. And when he grew up, he was taken into the Japanese army.
Isn't that amazing, that connection?
Yeah. So he wrote a letter back to Smith, and Smith wrote a letter back to him. He said, I have your flag. My wife and I will come to Japan and give it back to you. So this was in the early 80s. And he and his wife went to Japan, and Katsukabe was so enamored of this process that he made 6 presentations. He presented the flag to him in a ceremony in his little village, and then afterwards he took the flag back. They went to 5 more villages and had 5 more presentations. Well, in 1986, the 10th Mountain had a big reunion in Seattle at the newly built, I've forgotten the name of the hotel, one of the big hotels. My wife didn't go, but I went to it, and there were 12 or 1,500 veterans gathered in the lobby at the opening of the reunion. And I saw Sherman Smith and recognized him. Not only recognized him, but he had his tag for the reunion with his name on it. And I walked up to him and stuck up my hand. I said, "Hi, you're Sherman Smith. I'm Tom Stewart." I didn't say captain. He looked me straight in the eye and he said, "I hated all officers," and turned on his heels and walked away. He hated all officers.
And did he remember you in particular?
I don't know whether he did or not at that point. But the senior, for the 87th.
After such a heartwarming story about the flag and everything.
Well, let me finish. The senior officer at that reunion was Lieutenant Colonel Wilson from the 1st Battalion. And the organization of the reunion was conducted by a man named Felix Church. And he was a soldier in the 87th who lost his leg in Italy. He had an artificial leg. And he and I were good friends. And the colonel asked him to set up the dinner celebration for the 87th Regiment veterans who were there. And he said, I want Stewart to be the MC for that dinner, the banquet for the 87th. Well, I knew a little story about Colonel Wilson. A good friend of mine, a captain, had gone with him on a R&R on a weekend to Florence between battles. We had about 4 major battle episodes. And between one of these episodes, they went to Florence. And because he was a field grade officer, a lieutenant colonel, he had entree to a British Army officers' hotel in Florence. And he was a bit of a tippler. When he got to a place like that, he had his whiskey bottle. And he was drinking whiskey at the dining table. And he had who was the famous General Patton. He had a pistol on his hip, a loaded pistol.
Dangerous combination.
And they had a little chamber group that played music for the people in the dining hall. And they struck up the William Tell Overture. Bang! Bang! Hi-oh, silver! Away! Shot right through the ceiling. He could have killed somebody. He could have been court-martialed. He was a good commanding officer, and the general saved him from court-martial because he didn't hurt anybody.
And you were able to
But what I
tell
did,
that story.
I reenacted it. We had a
You
little
didn't just tell it.
at the banquet. We had a little music group that played for the dinner, and I went to the leader of it and I said, "Can you play a few bars of the William Tell Overture?" Sure. Well, on the signal, I'll tell you when to start. And the banquet was at the Non-Commissioned Officers Club at Fort Lewis.
And this is when?
This is 86.
Okay.
And the whole 10th was there, but each regiment had its own separate banquet. So I was the MC, and I had approached the non-commissioned officer who was in charge of that facility, the Non-Commissioned Officers Club at Fort Lewis. Said, I want to get a starter's pistol. No, sir. No guns of any kind allowed in this building. So I had some good friends who were lieutenants. I got brown paper bags, had them blow them up. And on the signal, that little music group struck up the William Tell Overture. Bang, bang, bang.
How did Wilson react?
And Wilson was mad at me. He said it didn't happen. But Sherm Smith, the sergeant, came up to me, stuck out his hand. He said, Stewart, you're all right. Anyhow.
And what's interesting about this Japanese flag that
well,
it sounds
Sherman Smith invited Colonel Katsakabe to come to that banquet, that reunion of the 87th. The 10th wasn't involved in Kiska, only the 87th Regiment. And Katsakabe was there, and I met him and I spent an hour with him. And here's what happened. He spoke good English, as I told you. And he was assigned, I think he was a sergeant in the Japanese Army, and he was assigned to man a radar unit that they had captured from the British battleship Prince of Wales when it was sunk in shallow water in Singapore Harbor at the beginning of the war in the Pacific. And they shipped that radar unit to Kiska, and it was up on top of the ridge, except for the volcano north of it. It had about more than 300 degrees range to.
And this was the secret radar unit that you
Yes.
were transporting.
No. The That was at that was at Sitka.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's a different one. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
And that was an American radar unit that.
Okay. Okay.
This was something the Japanese
Okay.
had captured from the British, and they set it up on top of the island to help the defense of their camp on Kiska. And he was up there on top of the ridge above the Kiska Harbor, which is a very good harbor, well protected. And what happened was, those 6 American ships, the 2 cruisers and the 4 destroyers that were running the blockade, there were 7, 5 destroyers and 2 cruisers. All 7 of those skippers observed moving targets between them and the island. They fired hundreds of rounds of ammunition. They observed it on the radar. They couldn't see the targets. They were over the horizon, so they couldn't visually see them. But they picked them up in the radar, about 7, 8, maybe 10 moving targets between them and the shore. They fired hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Kasakabe told me this story in detail.
40 years later.
And the skippers communicated in English. They rushed over to the target zone, nothing. Found absolutely nothing. Later, in 1995, my wife and I went to a program in Anchorage where the Army was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And we had a banquet speaker. At the moment, I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book called The 1,000-Mile War. Have you ever seen that? The 1,000-Mile War? Well, this man wrote this book about the war in the Aleutian Islands. And he determined what had actually happened. He had a letter from an old Aleut fisherman who used to fish in the waters off of Kiska and Attu. And he described a bird, and at the moment I'm not remembering the name, but there's a type of bird that flies in massed flocks of maybe several thousand birds, and there may be 6 or 8 flocks of birds, and they fly right close to the water. And he's the only explanation for those skippers picking up the targets on the radar was it was flocks of these birds flying between them and the island. Well, they were communicating in English. Kasakabe sitting up on the top of the island listening to what they're saying. They said, we are going to withdraw for 12 hours and go back to the nearest base towards Dutch Harbor and rearm and resupply with ammunition and food. We'll be gone for 12 hours. The Japanese had a rescue fleet, 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, standing about 300 miles offshore of the Aleutians, waiting for a coded signal to tell them it was a good time to come in. They had good charts, they'd navigated the island, and they came in at night, and in 55 minutes, they took 5,500 men off the beach at Kiska and loaded them onto those ships.
Unbeknownst to you and the American troops until...
Unbeknownst to anybody, any Americans, in the middle of the night. And what they had done was they had stripped the decks of those 6 vessels and had loaded shore landing craft, beach landing craft on the vessels, came into the harbor, dropped them over the sides, sent them to the beach.